When you hear the story of Moses standing at Pharaoh's court, I mean, what do you actually picture?
Oh, I know exactly what everyone pictures.
Right. If we're being honest, for most of us, it's a highly produced cinematic event.
Yeah, totally.
Like, it's a supernatural contest. You've got, Charlton Heston in the classic movie, or maybe the animation from The Prince of Egypt.
Oh, yeah, the dramatic music, the lighting.
Exactly. It is this fairy tale clash where the good guy throws down a magical staff. It turns into this giant snake, eats the evil sorcerer's snakes, and basically the magic trick of the divine wins the day.
Right. It's the ultimate Sunday school lesson.
It is. We've been completely conditioned to view it that way. But, what if we completely strip away that sentimental fairy tale framing?
We really need to do that.
Yeah, because what if we approach this text not as a story about magic at all, but as a razor-sharp diagnostic study in the epistemology of evidence?
I mean, that completely shatters the traditional reading. And frankly, it's a much more terrifying and relevant lens for today.
It really is.
Because if you remove that mythical veneer, you aren't looking at a battle of wizards. You are looking at a socio-economic systems analysis.
Wow. Okay, a systems analysis. So break that down for me.
Well, we're dissecting what happens when a massive, entrenched, authoritarian architecture, a system that is entirely built on manufactured spectacle and, controlling the narrative.
Right.
What happens when that system suddenly encounters undeniable, genuine evidence that contradicts its core operating system?
I want to spend our entire time today exploring this exact dynamic, because the source material we are diving into today is going to completely rewire how you look at the mechanics of power.
It really changes everything.
We are doing a deep dive into an incredibly analytical lecture by Ghulam Ahmad Parwez, and the focus is specifically on Surah 26, which is known as Ash-Shu'ara, verses 7 through 35.
Yeah, and the brilliance of Parwez here is that he absolutely does not read this like a theologian giving a sermon.
No, not at all.
He reads it like a master sociologist, or maybe a systems engineer, who is actively dissecting the survival mechanics of a human civilization.
Yeah, he looks at the staff and the white hand, not as, these miracles demanding blind faith, but as actual evidence demonstration.
Exactly. The real test in the narrative isn't whose magic is stronger.
Right. It's not a wizard duel.
No. The test is whether the people watching can distinguish genuine, objective evidence from a state-manufactured performance.
And to set up that test properly, Parwez doesn't actually start with Pharaoh, does he?
He doesn't. He immediately establishes a foundational framework for the listener to serve as a baseline point of comparison.
Right, the setup.
Yeah, he sets up this structural contrast right at the beginning of the text in verses 7 through 9. And these verses describe the earth producing what is translated as every noble pair, or Zal-Karim.
Zal-Karim. Okay, so that right there, that is our baseline.
Exactly. This productive natural universe is essentially the control group in our sociological experiment.
Oh, I absolutely love framing it that way, the control group.
It's perfect, right?
I mean,
Because
right.
it operates rationally, it operates abundantly, and crucially, it does so without any political mediation.
Which means Pharaoh's court, the system we're about to watch, basically panic and malfunction, is the experimental group.
That contrast is the entire argument of the text. Parwez insists we have to keep this baseline of the natural universe in mind.
Because it highlights how absurd the artificial system is.
Precisely. It highlights the total malfunction of Pharaoh's architecture.
Then let's start by looking really closely at that control group, right?
Yeah.
The baseline of reality. Parwez does this deep linguistic dive into the exact phrasing used in the text.
He focuses so heavily on this Arabic term, Zal-Karim.
Yeah, every noble pair, every dignified couple. I mean, the language there is so incredibly specific.
It is. It's not describing some miraculous, spontaneous, magical abundance where, a feast just materializes out of thin air to feed a population.
Right, it's not a magic trick.
No, it is describing something much more profound because it is reliable. It's describing a highly productive system operating through rational complementarity.
Rational complementarity.
Think about the word Zaj. It means a pair, a spouse, a complement.
Okay.
It implies that absolutely nothing in the productive universe operates in total isolation. Every element in this natural system has its counterpart.
So every process has its partner.
Exactly. The nitrogen in the soil works with the roots of the plant. The carbon dioxide works with the leaves. It is an ecosystem defined by logical pairing.
And the word Karim.
It's often translated as noble or dignified, which suggests an abundance that doesn't degrade or exploit its own components to produce.
So it's an abundance built on mutual function, not extraction.
Which is the defining characteristic of truly systemic productivity. I mean, you plant a seed, you provide water, soil, and sunlight, and through a rational, integrated process, it yields a harvest.
Right, there's no trickery involved.
None. The seed doesn't need to be intimidated into growing by a tyrant. There is no PR firm or lobbying group required to convince the soil to interact with the wheat. The evidence of the system's perfection is the output itself.
It just works. I mean, it's kind of like a perfectly written open source code base.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Every single line of code has a complementary function. And when it all runs together, it naturally yields this productive output without needing a massive marketing budget to convince you the software is functioning.
Yeah, you don't need a CEO on a stage giving a keynote telling you the software is great.
Yeah.
You just run the code and it compiles perfectly.
Exactly. And this baseline of the open source code base, to use that analogy,
Wow.
it directly informs the epistemological argument Moses brings when he finally stands before Pharaoh.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because Pharaoh tries to interrogate him right off the bat. He asks a very direct, almost jurisdictional question.
Right. He asks, who is the Lord of the worlds?
And Moses' answer is profound, especially when you view it through this systems engineering lens. He replies that the Lord of this system is the one who gave each thing its form. The Arabic word used is kalaka, and then guided it to its function, which is hada.
Creation and guidance. Form and function.
Form and function. Moses is literally stating that the baseline of reality is governed by the principle that things have an inherent nature and a specific logical trajectory.
So a bird has a form that dictates its function of flight.
Exactly. A river has a form that dictates its flow. The universe operates on these objective, unalterable laws.
Okay, I see.
That is the ultimate authority, the Lord of the productive universe. It is a statement of radical, uncompromising objectivity.
Moses is basically saying, I represent the architecture of reality itself. I represent the system where form naturally meets function.
Yes.
Okay, but this is where I have to step in and push back on this a bit because, well, it sounds almost too pristine, right? I mean, if the universe operates this smoothly, if this natural order of Kalaka and Hada is so inherently logical, and if Zaj Karim naturally produces abundance without friction,
Yeah.
why does human civilization actually look the way it does?
That is the big question.
Right. Why do we so easily and almost universally throughout history default to the friction of a pharaonic system? Why build these massive, oppressive, bureaucratic structures if the open source code of the universe is already perfectly designed to provide for us?
Well, that discrepancy is the core sociological problem Parwez is analyzing. Human political architecture, especially imperial or authoritarian architecture, does not want to participate in that natural abundance.
It wants to control it.
Exactly. It wants to mediate it. It seeks to insert itself as a middleman between the Kalaka and the Hada.
Oh, wow. So it actively disrupts the natural flow.
Yes, by disrupting that rational complementarity, a system like Pharaoh's can create artificial scarcity. And that scarcity is what allows it to siphon off the output for a select elite few.
That is so cynical, but so accurate.
So Moses is essentially pointing at the universe and saying, look, the world operates on objective laws of form and function. It doesn't need your arbitrary political dictates to produce.
And Pharaoh instantly realizes the danger of that argument.
Of course he does. If the people realize the universe provides abundantly without his mediation, his entire job description is basically voided.
Because he can't argue with gravity. He can't argue with the changing of the seasons or the fact that a seed grows into wheat without his permission.
He literally cannot win a debate based on objective structural reality.
So what does a politician do when the data is indisputably against them?
They change the subject.
Yep, they pivot. Pharaoh pulls a classic political diversionary tactic. He immediately shifts the goalposts and asks, then what about the former generations?
Oh, that is such a recognizable move, isn't it?
It's the standard pivot. He tries to drag the conversation completely away from the structural, objective reality of how the universe operates right now.
And into the murky, highly emotional, and ultimately unprovable realm of history and theology.
Right. He's basically saying, well, if you're so right about this universal system, what happened to our glorious ancestors who built this empire?
What happened to the people who didn't believe what you're saying? Are they all condemned? He is trying to bait Moses.
Oh, completely.
Right.
He wants Moses to insult the ancestors.
Because that would outrage the court and immediately turned a structural debate into a cultural grievance.
It's a total culture war pivot. I mean,
Yeah.
if you can't win on the math,
Right.
if you can't win on the structural data of resource distribution, you pivot to an emotional wedge issue.
Exactly. You try to make your opponent attack the audience's beloved heritage so they just stop listening to the math altogether.
And the absolute brilliance of Moses in this text is that he completely refuses to take the bait.
He really does. He doesn't engage with Pharaoh's shift to historical complexity at all.
He simply says that the knowledge of the former generations is with his Lord in a record, effectively tabling the issue. Like, we're not talking about that.
He refuses to be diverted from the structural argument. And because Moses holds the line, Pharaoh is backed into a corner.
The diversion totally failed.
Yes, he cannot win the logical argument about the epistemology of evidence. Therefore, Pharaoh is forced to stop debating and start relying on the defense mechanisms of his own political architecture.
Which provides the perfect transition into dissecting the actual anatomy of Pharaoh's regime.
Let's do it.
Because Parwez's source material doesn't just treat Pharaoh as, like, a generically bad man sitting on a throne.
No, not at all.
It breaks down the machinery of this tyranny. It's a highly sophisticated interlocking system. It's an unholy trinity of power.
Right. To understand the threat Moses poses, you have to understand the three pillars Parwez identifies that keep this pharaonic system standing.
Okay, what are the three pillars?
First, you have political tyranny. This is the absolute monopoly on violence, law, and state coercion.
The military and the police state.
Exactly. Second, you have a religious priesthood. This is the ideological apparatus. A tyrant cannot rule by sword alone, right?
Right, he needs a story.
He needs a class of intellectuals and priests to justify the tyranny, to manufacture the spectacle, and to essentially convince the oppressed that the system is not just inevitable, but divinely ordained.
Wow. Okay. And the third pillar?
And third, you have capitalistic hoarding, the absolute monopolization of resources, land, and wealth by the elite class.
Okay, so Pharaoh isn't just an individual king.
No, he is the avatar of an entire consumptive architecture.
And what actually fuels that massive consumptive architecture? I mean, it completely depends on the subjugation of a massive disenfranchised workforce.
Yes.
And in this specific historical context, that workforce is the Bani Israel. They are the engine.
They are the forced labor that builds the monuments, works the fields, and generates the surplus value that the elite hoard.
So without that subjugated workforce, what happens?
The entire three-pillared machine grinds to a halt. The hoarded wealth dries up, which means the priesthood loses its funding. Which means the ideological justification vanishes, which means the political tyranny collapses. It is, by definition, a parasitic state.
Which casts Moses' arrival in a completely different light. And this is one of those historical details from Parwez's analysis that it blew my mind when I read it.
The diplomatic protocol part.
Yes, because the text is very specific about diplomatic protocol. Moses doesn't just show up at the palace gates waving a sword, acting like some wild-eyed rebel trying to spark a chaotic riot in the streets.
No, he follows the rules of engagement.
He enters the court as a formal ambassador. The text explicitly uses the word rasul, which means a messenger or an envoy representing the Lord of the Worlds.
And that adherence to diplomatic protocol is vital to the epistemology of the story. Moses is utilizing the formal channels of the ancient world.
It's very official.
Very. I mean, you can look at historical records from the era, like the Amarna letters, to see how incredibly rigid and formalized diplomatic interactions were between ancient Near Eastern powers.
He's not sneaking in.
No, Moses is demanding a formal audience, stepping into the court with the recognized immunity and standing of an envoy.
He's serving papers. He isn't making a personal, ambitious claim for the throne. He isn't walking in saying, I have a bigger army, step down so I can be the new dictator.
Exactly. His demand is purely socioeconomic and structural.
He has one single, laser-focused objective. The liberation of the oppressed workforce. He looks at Pharaoh and basically says, let the children of Israel go with me.
He is demanding that Pharaoh remove the artificial political mediation that is crushing their dignity.
Which is an existential threat disguised as a very polite diplomatic request.
Oh, absolutely.
So, how does the system respond to an ambassador demanding the removal of its primary power source?
Well, Pharaoh, having already failed at the former generation's diversion we talked about, tries a totally new tactic.
What does he do?
Psychological manipulation and personalization. He looks at Moses and attempts to leverage their shared history. He basically says, wait a minute, didn't we raise you in this very palace? Didn't you eat our food? Didn't you grow up enjoying the privileges of our elite class?
It is the ultimate attempt to buy someone off, or at least guilt trip them, using past favors.
Totally.
Pharaoh is trying to leverage a personal debt to invalidate a systemic critique. He is saying, you are a product of this system, Moses. You benefited from it. How dare you suddenly develop a conscience and critique it?
It's an attempt to make Moses look like a hypocrite in front of the entire court. You criticize our society, yet you participated in it.
Exactly that internet meme. Curious. You critique society, yet you exist in it.
Yes. But Moses' response is devastatingly sharp. He refuses to allow whatever personal history or comfort he experienced in that palace to justify the ongoing systemic enslavement of an entire nation.
Good for him.
He explicitly calls out Pharaoh's favor for what it actually is, a byproduct of atrocities.
Because why was he in the palace in the first place?
Exactly. Moses essentially counters with, the only reason I was in your palace to be raised by you is because your regime was slaughtering our children and enslaving my people, which forced my mother to cast me into the river in a basket just to save my life.
Right. Your favor isn't generosity. It's built on blood and systemic oppression.
He completely neutralizes the guilt trip. It's a brilliant counter.
Okay, let me jump in here, because this raises a real tactical question that I think anyone looking at this as a manual for systems change has to ask.
Okay, what is it?
If Moses knows the system is this corrupt, if he knows it's built on blood, and he is standing right there in the room with the guy running it, why play this formal diplomatic game at all? I mean, he has the workforce, the enslaved people vastly outnumber the elite. Why does he just politely ask Pharaoh to let the people go? Why not just use his influence to incite a violent uprising right there and burn the whole parasitic structure to the ground?
That is the temptation of every revolutionary throughout history, right?
Yeah, just burn it all down.
Cut off the head of the snake. But if you look at historical precedent, and if you follow Parwez's analysis closely, brute force alone does not actually dismantle a corrupt architecture.
It doesn't.
It usually just changes the management. Think about it. If Moses orchestrates a chaotic uprising and just assassinates Pharaoh tomorrow, what actually happens?
I guess he just creates a massive power vacuum. Or he becomes the new Pharaoh himself.
Exactly. Or it results in a massive, uncoordinated bloodbath where the oppressed people, the very people he's trying to save, suffer the most casualties.
Oh, that makes sense.
To truly dismantle an epistemology of oppression, to make sure the system cannot just reboot itself under a new name, you have to exhaust its logic first.
Exhaust its logic. I love that phrase.
You have to expose its internal contradictions, not just to Pharaoh, but to the council, to the priests, and to the oppressed people themselves.
So the illusion of Pharaoh's absolute power must be broken intellectually and structurally before it is broken physically.
Yes. Moses repeatedly challenges Pharaoh to use his intellect, his capacity for reason. The Arabic word Parwez highlights is takilun.
Takilun, okay.
He is challenging the very foundation of the regime's legitimacy. He's offering Pharaoh a rational, structural choice. Recognize the objective reality of the universe, the kalaka and hada we talked about earlier, and voluntarily release the workforce.
And if the workforce is removed peacefully?
The parasitic state naturally collapses under its own weight because it has no fuel. It literally starves to death, but without the chaotic bloodshed of a blind uprising.
It is a calculated structural dismantling.
Exactly. And because Moses approaches this formally, demanding this structural change rather than just executing a crude transfer of power, Pharaoh finds himself in a massive, humiliating bind.
Because he can't simply snap his fingers and have Moses executed on the spot.
Right. Moses is acting as a formal ambassador. If Pharaoh just murders an unarmed envoy who is calmly asking for socio-economic reform, he looks weak.
He looks tyrannical and terrified, even to his own elite council.
He would be violating the very diplomatic norms that his own empire relies on to interact with other nations and maintain trade. He is trapped by his own protocols.
Wow. So Pharaoh cannot win the logical debate about the universe. He cannot win the historical diversion. He cannot guilt-trip Moses. And he cannot use brute force without destroying his own legitimacy.
Precisely. Therefore, Pharaoh has only one option left.
Which is?
He must completely recategorize the nature of the threat. He has to change the definition of what is happening in that room in order to protect his regime's architecture.
And this brings us to what I consider the absolute most critical paradigm-shifting pivot in Parwez's entire sociological reading.
It really is the turning point.
Yes, this is where we have to completely explode the miracle versus magic myth. So Moses finally presents his evidence. We all know the imagery from the story. He throws down the staff, and it behaves like a serpent. He draws his hand from his cloak, and it is shining brilliantly white.
The famous moments.
Right. Now, how does Pharaoh categorize this evidence? He doesn't call it a miracle. He immediately reflexively labels it as sior.
Magic.
Magic. But to understand what is actually happening in this room, we have to deeply unpack the socio-historical context of that word.
We absolutely must, because our modern understanding of the word completely obscures what's actually happening in the text.
Yeah, totally.
When a modern listener hears magic, they think of a guy in a tuxedo pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Or they think of a fantasy novel with wizards casting fireballs.
Like Harry Potter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in the context of the ancient world, think of the ancient magi in Persia, or the high priests and viziers in ancient Egypt. Magic meant something very specific and very, very political.
What did it mean?
It meant manufactured spectacle. It meant statecraft. It was the utilization of hidden knowledge, whether that was predicting a solar eclipse, understanding basic chemistry, or using optical illusions to awe and control an uneducated populace.
It's the smoke and mirrors of maintaining an empire. It's the elite class keeping the working class terrified of their so-called divine power.
Statecraft is the perfect word for it, because it shifts the entire domain of what Moses is doing.
Okay, explain that.
When Pharaoh points at the staff and the white hand and calls it magic, we cannot analyze this as a theological accusation. He isn't saying, your invisible God is fighting my invisible gods.
Right.
He is making a jurisdictional accusation.
Yeah.
It is a highly defensive, epistemological
It's a
move.
defensive move.
Yes. Notice what Pharaoh does not do. He does not actually evaluate Moses' evidence. He hasn't ordered his scholars to look closely at the staff or to conduct a rational inquiry to determine if this phenomenon is a genuine aspect of the natural universe's Kalaka and Hada.
Because if he accidentally accepts it as genuine objective evidence,
Yeah.
the game is over.
The game is instantly over. Accepting it as genuine evidence would require him to acknowledge a structural reality, a power higher than his own arbitrary dictates.
Which, as we established, would require restructuring his entire political architecture. He'd have to abandon his divine status and release his slave labor.
So the label magic is not the conclusion of an investigation. The label precedes the analysis. It is a defensive classification designed specifically to shut down critical thought.
It's a mental quarantine zone.
Exactly. By calling it seer, Pharaoh is signaling to his court, this falls under state security and trickery, not objective reality. You don't need to look closely at this. I've already categorized it. It's just a performance.
Wow. So what does this mean for how an authoritarian system processes new, challenging information?
It means it fundamentally doesn't process it at all.
Right. Once that magic label is applied, Pharaoh stops debating Moses entirely.
He's done.
He turns his back on the ambassador and immediately pivots to his mala. This is his inner council, right? His cabinet of elite advisors, military generals, and high priests. And look at how he frames the issue to them, because this is a masterclass in political manipulation. He says, this man is a skilled magician who wants to drive you out of your land with his magic. What do you command?
The sequence of that sentence is incredibly revealing of how entrenched power operates when it's threatened by truth.
Walk me through it.
Step 1. Dismiss the evidence as a mere trick, a professional illusion. Step 2. Consult the elite council, the very people whose extreme wealth and status depend entirely on the subjugation of the Bnei Israel.
And step 3.
This is the most crucial part. Translate the epistemological challenge into a terrifying territorial and political threat. He doesn't say Moses wants to debate the nature of reality.
Right, he says he wants to drive you out of your land. It's such a brilliant, if utterly cynical, tactic. It instantly reframes a structural debate into an existential crisis.
Exactly.
And, looking at this through Parwez's systems analysis, it reminds me so much of how a modern corporate monopoly operates.
No, how so?
Imagine you have a massive legacy technology company, right? They completely control the market. Their software is on every single computer, but their product is bloated, it invades your privacy, and it relies on exploiting user data.
Sure.
Suddenly, a small group of open source developers arrives with a superior decentralized technology. It's mathematically proven to be faster, safer, and it literally doesn't exploit anyone.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Does the monopoly evaluate the new tech objectively, admit it's better, and adopt it? Absolutely not.
They can't. Admitting the new tech is structurally superior
Right.
instantly destroys their multi-billion-dollar business model.
Right, so instead what do? They label the new tech as dangerous, unregulated, or like a haven for criminals.
That's the magic label.
Exactly. They convene an emergency board meeting, and then they launch a massive, extremely expensive lobbying and PR campaign claiming that this new startup is going to destroy the industry, ruin the economy, and threaten national security. They take a purely technological and evidentiary challenge, which is literally just better code, and they translate it into a political and economic threat.
That analogy maps perfectly onto Parwez's reading of the Council. The Mala move is identical across thousands of years of human history.
He never changes.
The system's response to an epistemological challenge, which is, again, genuine evidence that you cannot logically refute, is always to translate it into a political threat.
Because you can't fight truth, but you can fight a political enemy.
Exactly. Political threats can be managed by political means. You can arrest a political threat. You can smear a political threat. You can literally go to war with a political threat.
But genuine evidence.
Genuine evidence cannot be arrested or smeared. If it's a debate about objective truth, Pharaoh loses. If it's a debate about national security and protecting our land from this dangerous foreign trickster, Pharaoh can rally the troops and justify any action.
And by doing this, Pharaoh activates the system's absolute deepest survival instincts. He triggers the regime's standard operating procedure for self-preservation.
He does.
And this leads us to what Parwez identifies as a universal law of history, the law of requital, or mukafat e amal.
Yes.
The system begins to respond to the evidence, but it responds in a way that is structurally destined to be self-destructive.
Let's break down that standard operating procedure because the council's advice to Pharaoh is incredibly telling.
Yeah, what do they tell him to do?
Once Pharaoh has stoked this fear of losing their wealth and land, the Mala advises him, delay Moses and his brother and send gatherers into the cities to bring you every skilled sorcerer.
Ah.
This is the exact blueprint of how a threatened, non-productive system operates. Step 1, buy time. Delay the reckoning.
Right, stall.
Step 2, mobilize the state's entire counter-narrative apparatus. Step 3, stage a massive manufactured counter-demonstration to overwhelm the genuine evidence with sheer volume and spectacle.
Okay, here's what I don't get, and it's the massive, glaring logical flaw in the council's strategy that makes Parwez's analysis so deeply satisfying.
What's the flaw?
If Pharaoh and his council are so utterly convinced that what Moses did was just a cheap magic trick, if it's just an amateur street illusion, why are they panicking?
Right.
Why do you need to delay? And more importantly, why deploy the entire imperial intelligence apparatus to scour the cities to find the absolute best, most highly paid professional sorcerers in the empire just to stop a guy with a wooden stick?
It's absurd.
It seems like an incredible overreaction and a massive waste of the empire's money.
Because the overreaction is the tell.
Ah.
It is an implicit concession of the highest order. The Mala can call it a trick all they want in public, but their actions reveal their true assessment.
Right, look at what they do, not what they say.
The very act of this massive empire-wide mobilization is a structural acknowledgement that the evidence Moses presented is genuine, unprecedented, and absolutely terrifying to the regime. If it were a simple parlor trick, the palace guards could have laughed him out of the room, or a junior apprentice magician could have exposed him on the spot. The sheer, staggering scale of the state's reaction reveals the true scale of the threat.
They know they are not dealing with a trickster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're dealing with reality.
And that leads right into the economic consequences of this response. Because this law of requital isn't just about the regime being hypocritical, right? It's about the fact that this response is economically devastating to the system itself.
Precisely. The law of requital dictates that actions have inescapable systemic consequences. Think about the resource depletion happening here.
Okay, yeah.
The pharaonic system's response to genuine evidence is not to process it, evaluate it, or adapt to it. Its response is to deploy massive, desperately needed resources against it.
Right.
Every ounce of bureaucratic energy spent delaying Moses, every imperial agent sent out to scour the cities, every single professional sorcerer pulled away from their normal administrative or religious duties and mobilized to the capital to suppress the truth.
All of that costs money.
All of that represents a massive expenditure of state resources.
Resources that cannot be used for anything productive.
Exactly. The system is actively consuming itself to protect its architecture of consumption. It is bleeding its own treasury dry just to maintain the facade that it is still in control.
It's like an engine that is running so hot it has to burn its own fuel just to power the cooling system so it doesn't melt down.
That's exactly it.
But because all the energy is going to the cooling system, the engine isn't actually driving the car anywhere. It is maintaining the illusion of function while completely hollowing itself out from the inside.
That image of a bloated, reactive, self-consuming political state provides the perfect lens to pull back and look at the entire arc of our deep dive today. This is where Parwez's structural argument achieves its final synthesis, bringing us right back to where we started.
Let's draw that final structural comparison for the listener because it is so stark when you lay it out like this.
Okay, let's do it.
Think back to the control group we started with at the top of the episode, verses 26.7 through 9. A universe that endlessly produces because it is governed by rational complementarity.
Right, the earth growing every noble pair. Zosh Kareem.
Exactly. Every element working with its counterpart to create real, tangible growth without friction. Now, look at the experimental group, verses 26.10 through 35, which we just walked through.
The contrast is jarring.
You have a massive, terrifying political architecture that, for all its pomp and power, produces absolutely nothing. The only thing it produces is the desperate continuation of its own existence.
And that is why Parwez's reading demands that we see this entire narrative not as a theological clash between religion and irreligion, or a battle between believers and pagans.
That framing is way too small.
It misses the point completely. This is a systems analysis. It is a clash between two fundamentally opposed epistemological architectures.
Two ways of handling reality.
One architecture, represented by Moses and the natural universe processes evidence, aligns with objective reality, and fosters productivity and liberation.
Right. The other architecture, represented by Pharaoh's court filters evidence, suppresses truth, categorizes reality as magic to avoid dealing with it, and consumes its own resources just to survive another day.
It really all comes down to the energy budget of truth versus the energy budget of a lie.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the productive universe does not need to convene a frantic elite council to decide if a seed is allowed to grow.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't need to defensively label a rainstorm as magic or a security threat to avoid dealing with it. It doesn't need to mobilize professional, highly paid, counter-narrative lobbyists to justify why the sun rises in the east.
Right. It simply operates on the truth of its own form and function.
Conversely, Pharaoh's court is entirely reactive. Its entire energy budget is completely dominated by responding to signals it lacks the capacity, or rather the political willingness, to process.
It exists in a state of perpetual anxiety, terrified of any piece of genuine evidence that might disrupt its monopoly on power. And when you realize that, it makes you understand that placing the image of the earth growing every noble pair at the very top of the Surah isn't just like poetic filler meant to set a nice pastoral scene before the action starts.
No, it's highly intentional.
It is the ultimate structural reminder. It is the text telling you up front, before you even meet Pharaoh, which architecture actually runs the universe.
Yes.
And which architecture is inherently fragile, artificial, and doomed to eventually collapse under its own paranoid, top-heavy weight.
It is a profound, timeless socioeconomic blueprint. When you strip away the fairy tale, the text provides a razor-sharp diagnostic tool for identifying systems of oppression in any era.
Any era.
It tells you exactly how those systems will react when confronted with undeniable truth. They won't evaluate, they will classify, they will mobilize their PR apparatus, and ultimately they will consume themselves trying to fight reality.
The sheer intellectual thrill of looking at this text this way is just amazing to me.
It's eye-opening.
We take this classic story, a story literally almost everyone thinks they know inside out since childhood, and by looking through Parwez's analytical lens, we find a manual for civilizational survival underneath it all.
Exactly.
We've completely moved from magical staffs and giant snakes to the epistemology of evidence, diplomatic protocol, and systemic resource depletion.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on this systems analysis.
Yeah, please do.
Because this isn't just about ancient Egypt.
I want you to look at the structures in your own life today.
That's the real takeaway.
Look at the organizations you work for, the corporate hierarchies you navigate, the communities you are part of, or even the information ecosystems and media platforms you consume daily.
Yeah, how are the systems in your life actually built?
Ask yourself, are they structured like the productive universe?
Yeah.
Do they operate on rational complementarity, where every element pairs perfectly to create genuine growth, and where new, challenging evidence is processed objectively and transparently? Or are they structured like Pharaoh's court? Are they spending their entire energy budget frantically reacting to external threats, labeling inconvenient evidence as magic or fake news, and relying on manufactured spectacle and top-down PR just to justify their continued existence?
Which architecture are you feeding your time and energy into? Because as we've seen today, one architecture builds the universe, and the other is just a very expensive magic trick waiting to be exposed.